What's up guys, how you doing? Welcome to another video. So today we're talking about how you can get better quality results from cheaper camera equipment. I know I've got a lot of people following my channel who won't necessarily be using like higher level gear. They won't be using things like the 1DX Mark III, 1DX2, R5, R6. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just like myself, people who first start out in photography, whether it's sports photography or any other type of photography, are often going to start with lower end market entry gear. But that doesn't mean that you should let that restrict you. It doesn't mean that you should think, oh, I can't do certain things because of my gear. Now, of course, there are limitations. There are certain things that you can't achieve with lesser gear, and that's why some of the top end photographers, especially in the sports world, will spend thousands of pounds on gear, because it certainly does get better results in the longer term, and of course it makes it easier to get those results. But that doesn't mean you should let it stop you, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into it, I'm going to ask you guys to do all the usual YouTubery for me. Make sure you hit that like button. It helps me out loads on my channel, and I really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. We smashed out 10,000. We've done 11,000 now. Let's keep on going. Let's keep on growing the channel. Make sure you like and subscribe. So right, let's get into this. Now, it doesn't really matter which specific camera you have with this advice. I've tried to pick a few tips that will work generally. When I first started out, I was using the Canon 7D Mark I. I went from there to the 7D Mark II, and I used that for a long time, for several years, until I moved to my 1DX Mark I and now my Canon R6. So I have lots of experience of trying to get good results, and I think I did get some good results with cheaper camera gear. I even made a video recently where I got what I think are pretty good results using an old Canon 350D that cost me £40 on eBay. I'll link that video right here if you want to go check that one out. Okay, so tip number one, and this is very much a sport-specific tip. A lot of people will feel like they are limited with low-light performance, because with lesser gear, you do struggle in low light because you have to get that ISO level up, and cheaper cameras do struggle at higher ISO levels. But tip number one is going to be, don't be afraid of higher ISO levels. Nowadays, you can bump up your ISO a lot higher than you used to be able to. Cameras deal with low light really well. Got a couple of examples here. Now, these are examples that I took using the 7D Mark II, a camera that people used to say, oh, you can't use higher ISO on that camera. Well, here you go. These were shot at 5,000, 6,400 using the Canon 7D Mark II. Decent results, if I do say so myself. When it comes to the newer cameras like the 1DX, you can go even higher. This is a photo that was shot at 10,000 ISO, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. It doesn't look grainy in the slightest. Now, I know some of you guys are going to be saying, yeah, but that's a Canon 1DX, it's not cheaper gear. Well, two things I would say to that. A, it kind of is cheaper gear now. You can buy a used 1DX on eBay for a really good price. So don't assume a 1DX is out of reach just because you're shooting on a budget. But beyond that, editing software nowadays helps you deal with noise so well. You could go out there with a cheaper camera, shoot it at ISO 6400, and then you can work on that graininess, work on that noise in Photoshop, Lightroom, and of course you can get specialist equipment. Things like Topaz is supposed to be fantastic, although I should say I've never used it, but I hear things to say it's amazing at dealing with noise. You guys who have used that, hit it in the comments below, because it will help other people watching the video to get your feedback on how you find Topaz to deal with noise in photos. We'll check it out at some point on the channel. We'll make sure we do that. Okay, so tip number two is going to be to break a golden rule for sport. I'm going to say, if you need to, don't be afraid to bring that shutter speed down a bit. Now, with sports, you generally will always want to try to keep your shutter speed above 1,000th of a second. Something like 12/50th of a second ideally, even faster if you can, but kind of 1,000 is sort of the minimum. But if you have to, like if you've got your camera and the ISO level is as high as you can reasonably use it, and your photos are still underexposed, don't be afraid to drop that shutter speed slightly. It's not ideal. You will start to see movement with like a ball or feet or hands or something like that, but that's better than not being able to take the photo because it's too dark. So don't be afraid to bring down that shutter speed a little bit if you have to. Here's some examples of photos that I shot at 1/640th of a second back when I was using my 7D Mark I, because I had to reduce that shutter speed to get a decent exposure on the photos. Here's one from right back when I started out. This one was shot at 1/400th of a second. Yeah, you you can see movement, like especially in the ball, but actually it's still a good photo, a good sports photo, shot at 1/400th of a second. So if you need to, you can reduce your shutter speed a little bit. Don't be afraid to do that if you're using a cheaper camera whilst you're starting out to get a decent exposure on the photo. Okay, tip number 3 is going to be to say quite simply, get yourself an f2.8 lens. That will make a huge amount of difference. I have people message me to say, oh Rob, I've got to shoot a game under floodlights and my fastest lens is an f4 or an f5.6 and I really struggle. And yeah, you know what, you will really struggle. So get yourself an f2.8 lens. Now that doesn't mean you have to go and blow your budget on one lens. You can get some cheap f2.8 lenses, and are they the best f2.8 lenses you can get? No, they're not. Will they be the best long-term investment? No, maybe not. But what they will do is get you an f2.8 lens right now that you can go use, which will help you in lower light, and you'll be able to get some better photos. Some of the third-party lenses, I've used before a Sigma 300mm f2.8, which was good. You can get that for a good price on eBay. Some of the other Sigma lenses, like the 120 to 300 f2.8, again, those are decent lenses. Some of the old Canon lenses, like this is the Mark I version of the Canon 70 to 200 f2.8. You can pick these up used on eBay for a really good price now. So you can get f2.8 lenses without spending a huge amount of money. You can even get yourself something like the good old nifty 50, the 50mm f1.8. That's going to help you out loads. You crush your backgrounds. Good low light performance, lovely portrait lens, and it's going to cost you less than £100. So get yourself an f2.8 or faster lens. That will help your camera so much. Okay, tip number 4. Jumping back a little bit to what I said earlier when we were talking about noise and editing photos. That's going to be tip number 4. Learn to edit photos really well. It doesn't matter what camera you take photos with. If you learn to edit them really well, they will look so much better. You can crop in closer if you don't have a long lens. You can straighten your photo if you get your horizon wrong. You can adjust your colors, your contrast, your clarity, your highlights, your shadows, all the different things that maybe you'll struggle a bit with cheaper gear. You can correct those things in post if you become a really good editor. Like we talked about earlier, you can reduce noise, like significantly you can reduce noise in photos if you learn to edit. Of course, I use the Adobe programs, I use Lightroom, Photoshop, but there's lots of other editing programs you can use as well. What I would say though is once you get hold of one, stick with it, try and learn it as well as you possibly can, because if you really learn it and you know how to get the best from that software, you're going to become a much better photo editor. And that in turn will improve your photos regardless of which camera you are using. And lastly, tip number 5 is going to be think about all of the factors outside of your camera. So for example, if you want to go and try and shoot some sports for the first time and you've got a cheaper camera and you've only got an f4 lens, well, you know what? Think about the sports you're going to shoot. Try and find something that's during the day, for example. If you go and try and shoot a game at night time under rubbish floodlights with an f4 lens, you're setting yourself up to fail. So go try and find yourself a game on a weekend during the day when the sun's out. Then it doesn't matter, your ISO's set at 100. You can set your shutter speed as high as you like. Even with a budget entry-level camera, you'll be able to get some lovely photos if you go shoot in the middle of the day. Other factors to think about will be things like backgrounds. A more expensive lens, so an f2.8 lens for example, one of the things it does is it crushes the background, and so it matters a little bit less about what you've got going on behind your subject. One of the things that affects something like an f5.6 lens is the background is a bit more in focus. You can see a bit more of what's going on, and it can be distracting from the portrait. So one of the things you could do is when you turn up to photograph wherever it is you're going to photograph, think about where you're sitting, think about what's opposite you, and therefore what will your background be. If you can sit yourself somewhere where you've got a nice clean background, well actually it doesn't matter so much if your f5.6 lens isn't crushing that background. It's not making the depth of field more shallow, because it's not a cluttered background, nice and clean, and then it doesn't matter so much. Now of course there's lots of other factors as well, but you see what I mean? Think about all of the non-equipment factors that will affect your photo that will help you get better results from your cheaper gear. Now I think that just about rounds us off, guys. 5 solid tips to help you get better photos, especially better sports photos using cheaper gear. This channel was built using one original video all about how to shoot sports on a budget. And yes, fine, I'm shooting professional sports now and I'm using much better gear. But that doesn't mean that I forgot how to do that before. I went through all that myself, so I know what you guys are dealing with out there if you've got cheaper gear. Don't be disheartened. Follow some of those tips and you can still get some great photos. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like button. Like I said earlier, it just helps my channel to be more successful. Let's be honest, that's where I ask you to do it. Thank you very much for doing it on every single video. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Guys, thank you very much for watching. I will see you on the next video.